Oh my god. This is going to be crazy. Super duper whopper super duper mega ultra extreme major cutty cut. This time we made 50 bloopers. First of all, we made a color blooper. Second of all, we made a background color blooper. Third of all, we made a font blooper. Fourth of all, we made a fan-made language blooper. Fifth of all, we have a different letter. Sixth of all, we have a different uppercase letter. Seventh of all, a different letter has been added. Eighth of all, a different uppercase letter has been added. Ninth of all, why does D have a teeth? 10th of all, we made a glitchy blooper on the TVO text. 11th of all, why is Joho Pixar doing here instead of Super Cry Baby? 12th of all, we have a different number. 13th of all, we have a different number on the TVO text. 14th of all, we have a Greek letter. 15th of all, we have an Indonesian letter and it's still floating. 16th of all, we have a Colonese letter and it's still floating. 17th of all, a Talamese letter has been added. 18th of all, a different number has been added. 19th of all, a fan-made number has been added. 20th of all, one of the logo mascots is covered with deal paint. 21st of all, we have a different uppercase letter and it's still floating. 22nd of all, this time we have a fan-made a big number and it's still floating. 23rd of all, we have a crushed, Icelandic letter and it's still floating. 24th of all, we have a fan-made Russian letter and it's still floating. 25th of all, an Armenian letter has been added. 26th of all, we have a Balinese letter and it's still floating. 27th of all, we have a crushed image here. 28th of all, why is Aloma Pixar doing here? 29th of all, we have an Enyanese letter and it's still floating. 30th of all, we have a Mr. letter and it's still floating. 31st of all, a Mr. letter has been added. 32nd of all, we have a Joho Pixar letter and it's still floating. 33rd of all, we have a Spanish letter and it's still floating. 34th of all, a Portuguese letter has been added. 35th of all, we have a German letter and it's still floating. 36th of all, we have a crushed Greek letter and it's still floating. 37th of all, we have a Joho Pixar letter but it's dead and it's still floating. 38th of all, we have a different letter from the TVO text and it's still floating. 39th of all, we have a Russian letter from the TVO text and it's still floating. 40th of all, we have a Korean letter and it's still floating. 41st of all, a Mr. number has been added. 42nd of all, we have a different symbol and it's still floating. 43rd of all, we have a Coptic letter and it's still floating. 44th of all, we have a Hebrew letter and it's still floating. 45th of all, we have a crushed Russian letter and it's still floating. 46th of all, we have a Bradenese letter and it's still floating. 47th of all, we have a Greek letter and it's still floating. 48th of all, we have an Esperanto letter and it's still floating. 49th of all, we have an Arabic letter and it's still floating. And 50th of all, we have an Arabic number and it's still floating. This time we made 50 bloopers at once. And then everyone died. The end. That didn't help at all.